Welcome back, everyone. We are going to continue our discussion on Azure Virtual WAN by now discussing virtual hub routing. In this lesson, we will start with the high-level concepts of how routing works within a virtual hub, discuss the key terminology we will be referring to throughout this lesson, discuss the default routing implementation known as any-to-any routing, and then also talk about how to implement your own custom route tables to overwrite the default route table. Starting off with the high-level concepts of virtual hub routing, the first thing you need to know is that virtual hubs within a virtual WAN implementation each contain their own built-in route tables. In other words, each hub has its own routing tables used to navigate connections. Additionally, our hub connections, which include both virtual network and hybrid connections, all automatically associate and propagate their own network routes to the hub's default route table. We'll expand more on that here in just a second. And in addition to our default route tables, you also have the ability to create static or custom routes to your virtual hubs as well. Let's break each of those concepts down in a bit more detail, starting with some key terminology we need to know that we just talked about on the previous slide, specifically our terms of route association and propagation. So when interacting with a virtual hub, each network connected to that hub can either associate and or propagate its routes. When we say a network or specifically a connection is associating routes, what we mean by that is that any connection to our virtual hub is able to learn the routes, that's what we mean by association, and adopt those routes for its own connection. In other words, an association is learning the virtual hub's routes and then taking on those same routes for its own network routing table. By comparison, the term propagation is essentially the opposite, in which a connection, or more specifically the network behind its connection, adds its own network routes to that hub's route table. So again, association is a connection and the network behind it learning a hub's route, and a propagation is a connection or network providing or propagating its own routes to that hub's route table. Also, when discussing propagation, there is another default route table called none, which is optional. However, networks that propagate its routes to the none route table, as opposed to either of the custom or default route tables, actually does not add its own virtual network routes. This effectively isolates the virtual network because the routes to that network are not published to that hub. With all this in mind, keep in mind that all connections will associate to the default route table. However, propagation to the default route table is optional for further levels of isolation. So again, all connections will learn the default route table's routes. However, you can choose which networks do and do not contribute to that default route table. And when we discuss custom route tables here in just a moment, that can also provide additional layers of customization. Next, let's talk about the default routing scheme associated with the default routing table, known as any-to-any routing. Any-to-any routing is the default routing configuration for the standard virtual WAN SKU. Again, standard, not the basic SKU. Understanding any-to-any routing is pretty simple. Basically, everyone can talk to everyone else, or more specifically, all networks can communicate with all other networks, which include all Azure virtual networks and non-Azure connections, such as hybrid connections. And this any-to-any routing also propagates across multiple hubs as well. Really simple concept within a given virtual WAN implementation. Even if you have multiple hubs, everyone connected to every hub can talk to everyone else as well. Pretty simple concept. With that in mind, you also have the ability to create custom route tables as well. Maybe you don't want everyone to talk to everyone else. Maybe you want even more customized routes between networks or even different groups of networks. For this, you can create custom route tables inside of each individual virtual hub. These are custom route tables that sit alongside a hub's default route table. How it works, as opposed to our any-to-any routing, you can choose which connections, or in other words, which network connections, can associate, in other words, learn or propagate or add to those custom route tables. These custom routes are useful for scenarios such as isolating groups of networks from other networks. That applies for both virtual network connections and hybrid connections, and also scenarios in which you want to route traffic through different network virtual appliances attached to that hub. Now, the next thing you may be asking is, how does a virtual hub choose between the default routing table or a custom route table? Well, it's very much in line with our previous lessons on routing within virtual networks in general, in which custom route tables will always take priority over a default route table. In other words, a network connection that falls within the domain of a custom route table will have its association and propagations applied to the terms of the custom route table as opposed to the default route table. Again, very similar to our previous discussions on network routing. With that, that's going to conclude this conceptual overview of how routing works within a virtual hub. Let's once again go ahead and review our key takeaways before moving on. We started off with the high-level virtual hub routing concepts, in which we learned that each hub contains its own routing table, which also include a default routing table, which by default work with everything connected to that virtual hub, although custom routes certainly are possible. We then discussed the routing terminology to be familiar with, which include association, in other words, a connection will learn hub routes, and propagation, in which a connection will propagate or contribute its own routes to that virtual hub routing table. We then discuss our default routing type, which is any-to-any routing. Very simple concept to understand, in which everyone can automatically talk with everyone else, even across multiple virtual hubs within the same virtual WAN implementation. And then we finish by discussing custom routes, which take priority over the default route table, which is useful for scenarios like routing traffic through a virtual appliance or isolating individual virtual networks. That's going to go ahead and wrap this lesson up. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one.